Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Adam Mendelsohn, a professor of history at the University of Cape Town, and the author of The Jewish Soldiers in the Civil War, the Union Army, recently published by New York University Press. This book drew on an extraordinary new resource, the Chappell roster for American Jewish service during the Civil War, assembled for more than a decade by a team of researchers working at the National Archives and other repositories. Our program will begin with a brief introduction to the Chappell roster by Adrian de Armas, the head of the research team, who will describe how the roster can be used by scholars and students of the Civil War, as well as those whose ancestors fought in Union and Confederate uniform. After the introduction to the roster, our program will turn to the war itself, asking what was it like to be a Jewish soldier in Lincoln's armies. For that discussion, I'll be joined by Professor Jenna Wiseman-Joslet, the Charles E. Smith Professor of Judaic Studies and Professor of History at the George Washington University. A distinguished scholar, Professor Joslet has written widely about the relationship between material culture and identity, including important work on how Jews have creatively adapted and contributed to American culture. We'll discuss the everyday experiences of Jewish soldiers during the Civil War, as well as how Jews adapted to the challenges of the wartime environment and military life. We'll start, however, by turning our attention to the Chappell roster. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you so much, Adam. On behalf of the Chappell Manuscript Foundation, I want to thank all of you for attending, the National Archives Museum and the National Archives Foundation for hosting this program, and Thea Wieseltier for bringing us all together today. I also want to acknowledge the countless staff members, both past and present, at Archives One. From Trevor Plant and Dennis Edelin to the archives technicians and specialists in the military reference branch, central research, and microfilm rooms. Your knowledge and dedication to helping us find those hard-to-find documents, for more than a decade, by the way, has been critical to our mission. This would have been an impossible undertaking without you, so thank you. Because of Benjamin Chappell's vision, Ariane Wiesel-Margolit's leadership, and the research conducted by Caitlin Winkler, Alex Apito, Bonnie Zulu, and Janice Parente, the Chappell roster redefines how we look at Jews in the American Civil War. Adam Mendelsohn's outstanding job of transforming the data we've been amassing into such engaging and thought-provoking prose is proof of this. I speak for all the Chappell roster researchers when I say we love what we do. Sure, there's the surge of adrenaline when a Hail Moses request for a pension file yields a new name for the roster, but we also feel a deep sense of responsibility. History remembers some of the soldiers and sailors we research. Descendants remember their ancestors, but for the boys and men who served their country in its darkest hour, yet have no descendants or didn't leave footprints in the historical record, if we don't remember them, who will? And finally, if you know of a Jewish Civil War soldier or sailor, we hope you'll contact us at roster@chappell.org. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oops. Sorry, there we go. Okay. So, who was Simon Wolf? What do you need to know about him? And why are we reappraising his magnum opus? Briefly, Simon Wolf was a Bavarian-born immigrant who became a Washington, D.C.-based social justice warrior. He advised multiple U.S. presidents on Jewish-related topics. His legacy, a book entitled The American Jew as Patriot, Soldier, and Citizen, was created in response to anti-Semitic rhetoric about Jewish patriotism, or the lack thereof. Published in 1895, it included more than 8,000 names of soldiers and sailors who served in the American Civil War. As you can see, it was predominantly a somewhat alphabetical list of names and regiments, with the occasional detail, such as Victor Purley, 7th Infantry, killed at Chancellorsville. For Ben Chappell and other collectors with an interest in both the Civil War and American Jewish history, it was an invaluable resource, but it wasn't very user-friendly, and it wasn't 100% reliable. And so the idea of what would become the Chappell roster was born. Next slide, please. When I first started on this project in 2011, the assignment was to confirm military service for the names in Wolf's book and add any he overlooked. Scholars believe that if any of the names were not Jewish, the number was so insignificant as to not be worth our time and effort to check. The first seed of doubt about this assumption was planted by a Massachusetts soldier named Henry Marks, who was brought up on charges for stealing a ham for his personal use. The next clue came from an obituary for the mother of a Pennsylvania soldier named Philip Halpin. It stated that she'd, quote, lived a true Christian life, end quote, and so on and so on. As of today, our research has determined that 10% and counting of the names from Wolf's book are definitively not Jewish. So, as it turns out, not so insignificant after all. Now, this is not surprising, given that name profiling was considered a sound research methodology at that time. Nevertheless, if we were to create a solid foundation for the future study of American Jewish history, Wolf's 19th century work needed a 21st century upgrade. Next slide, please. So how do we do what we do? Carefully and collaboratively. We have two mandates: obtain proof of military service and evidence a soldier was Jewish. Service is usually pretty straightforward, but proving that someone who lived more than 150 years ago was Jewish is a bit trickier. Whereas not all resources are equally reliable, we look for evidence of religion in cemeteries, newspapers, archives, genealogical websites, and even military records. Aside from Union pension records, one of our best resources is descendants. So if you or someone you know has a Jewish ancestor who was in America circa 1860, please contact us. If they served, we want to include them in the roster. In addition to vetting the names in Wolf, we add the names he omitted. To date, we've added more than 1,500. And now that we're focusing on the Confederacy, that number is increasing exponentially. While I'm talking about numbers, allow me to address the most often asked question we received: how many Jews served in the Civil War? The reality is the answer changes every day. Between new additions and finding proof that a name from Wolf was actually Jewish, the Chappelle roster is constantly being updated. Next slide. More importantly, numbers tell us nothing about these men. Remember how Wolf listed Victor Purley killed at Chancellorsville? Here's what the Chappelle roster has for Victor Purley: affidavits from his mother, a photo, and more background information from his cousin, a family tree, and the register of his birth from a synagogue in Hungary, courtesy of a descendant I met on Ancestry.com who didn't know that Victor had immigrated to America and died at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Next slide. Much more than a military roll of honor, the Chappelle roster soldier pages contain the carefully collected details of their lives and, our favorite feature, the connections between them. Whether they married a fellow soldier's sister, maintained a lifelong friendship with someone they once shared a tent with, or served with their brothers, fathers, and cousins. After a decade of being immersed in their lives, I can tell you that not every one of them left footprints in the historical record. But when they did, we found them to be brave heroes and cowardly deserters, pillars of their communities and criminals. And while some died much too young, many others were celebrated centenarians. Getting to know each and every one of them has been a privilege and a pleasure, as has being here with you today. Thank you very much. Back to you, Adam.
Thank you, Adrian. Now, we're going to turn our attention to discussing the book which drew heavily on the magnificent work of Adrian and her team. It's a book titled Jewish Soldiers in the Civil War, which looks at the everyday experience of Jewish soldiers. It's the first of what will be a two-part series. The second will look at the experience of Jews in the Confederate armies.
Adam, ready to roll? Okay, so let's start wide and then narrow things down as we go along. So, as you know, over the years, those of us who study and teach modern Jewish history have come increasingly to see military matters and warfare as pivotal themes in modern Jewish history. The Napoleonic Wars, Russian conscription practices, the Dreyfus Affair, World War I, and of course, World War II, and even the Israeli wars of independence loom extremely large. My question then is, would you add the Civil War to that roster of landmark events in Jewish history? Or to put it another way, would you constitute the Civil War as a Jewish phenomenon, not just an American one?
Very good question. And as you correctly point out, there has been much new attention to war and military service in Jewish history, particularly in modern Jewish history. But interestingly, even as scholars have written about, particularly in a European context and increasingly in a Middle Eastern context, experience of Jews in the military. Again, there has been attention in the United States to the First World War and the Second World War. The Civil War has remained this interesting anomaly. I mean, there's an older literature about Jews and the war, but serious scholars, for the most part, have steered clear of the war. It's again, somewhat surprising given the centrality of the war to American history more broadly. And I think one of the things that this book argues, or makes an argument for putting the war back into American Jewish history in a number of ways. One, again, drawing on the work of the roster to reveal how the war affected the lives of Jewish soldiers who enlisted, and again, revealing how many Jewish soldiers did enlist, but also looking at the legacies of the war for the American Jewish community. Again, previously, the dominant way of understanding American Jewish history was really to think about waves of immigration, Jewish immigration to the United States. And again, looking initially at Sephardi immigration during the colonial period, then German Jewish immigration, immigrants from Central Europe in the mid-19th century, and then looking at Eastern European migration really from the 1880s onwards. And the Civil War really fitted uncomfortably within this Jewish understanding or an understanding of American history focused on Jews, really falling between Eastern European migration and German Jewish migration. And I argue in this book that the war has consequences which certainly are very, very important, well beyond the war years themselves. So really a war which to understand American Jewish history properly should receive appropriate attention.
So could you elaborate a little bit further, at least on one or two of those larger implications of the war? And also, while you're thinking about that, could you say a little bit more too about why historians have steered clear? I'm sure it goes beyond the historiographic conventions. Might there be some other ulterior motive?
So both of those are good questions. So certainly, to the first question about some of the legacies of the war, there are a whole number of ways that the war affects the American Jewish population, but two in particular really stand out. One of those are the economic consequences of the war, that Jews have been on the margins of the American economy prior to the war for a variety of reasons, particularly connected with a subject which you've written about, the garment industry, that it really provides opportunities for Jews to move from really peripheral economic roles to more central roles. So we see after the war, Jews really getting a foothold within the garment industry, and then beginning a meteoric rise within the garment industry as Eastern European Jews begin to arrive later. So it really transforms the economic position of Jews. We don't see, for the most part, for example, prominent Jewish bankers prior to the war. After the war, we begin to see this phenomenon emerge, again, as a result of the economic transformations, in some ways, opportunities of the war that presents to Jews. So that's one consequence. And the other, which is not unrelated to it, is that, again, during the war itself, we see the emergence of a whole variety of forms of the acceleration of a variety of forms of prejudice and discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly we see that with anti-Semitism as well. That anti-Semitism certainly predates the war, but the war changes it in a variety of ways. That we see, particularly in the first year of the war. There are scandals around military contracting. The American military grows from the small professional army of 15,000 strong before the war into an army. The Union Army will have more than 2 million men in uniform by the end of the war. So it's an enormous growth of the military, and therefore a rush to provide all sorts of things which soldiers need, uniforms, armaments, etc. And there's a free fall in the particular first year of the war, and the press, which is much agitated by the poor standards of the goods which are supplied, the shoddy clothing, for example, which is supplied, that we see a casting around for a villain, and Jew and contractor become interchangeable terms in that first year of the war, even though, again, Jews are a minority amongst those who are supplying the military and are certainly behaving no differently from anyone else. But certainly it creates the seed from which grows during the war quite venomous forms of anti-Semitism, which then will develop during the war into, for example, General Grant's notorious General Orders Number 11, and a variety of other episodes which again will recede initially once the war is over, but I think the seed is planted, and we see a recurrence of anti-Semitism, this new form of anti-Semitism, particularly in the 1870s, 1880s, once Eastern European Jews begin to arrive. To other question, again, a very good question about why historians have largely steered clear of Jews in the Civil War, professional historians. There are some certainly very good scholars who have written about the subject. There's very good work by Bertram Korn way back in the 1950s on this, and more recently, around the sesquicentennial of the war, there are a number of scholars have returned to the war as well, have written about Lincoln, have written about Grant, etc. So there is certainly a new interest. I think in some ways it reflects a number of factors. Ironically, it reflects something which I think which Adrian described earlier, which is the prominence of work by enthusiastic amateurs early on, by those who were interested in counting Jewish contributions to the war and listing a Jewish serviceman. And this was, I think, in many cases quite off-putting to professional historians who were looking for a serious subject, who didn't want to be involved in apologetics or celebration of Jewish service, and instead, therefore, steered clear. Likewise, what I mentioned earlier plays a role too, that American Jewish historians approached American Jewish history with a particular framework, thinking about waves of immigration. And again, the war didn't quite fit their thinking either.
Okay, fair enough. So let's just shift the landscape a little bit away from Jewish historiographic concerns to American ones more generally. I don't have to tell you that the landscape of Civil War studies is literally huge. There are battlefields and cemeteries and monuments and heaps of secondary sources and mountains of primary source documentation. So how then, Adam, did you manage to find your way and chart your course and develop the themes that dominate and inhabit your beautiful book? That couldn't have been an easy process.
So what helped the process of writing this book was very much what you described, that even though the literature on Jews was thin or uneven, and actually very little serious work done on particularly the everyday experiences of Jewish soldiers, what really helped is that there's a wonderful literature, and growing literature on the experience of soldiers more broadly, that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a growing literature, and again, a very strong literature on the experience of different ethnic and racial groups during the war as well. So it's a very good work on the experience of German soldiers, Irish soldiers, African Americans, on also a variety of religious groups during the war. And the reason I found that literature very useful is both in terms of using as a mechanism to think about what questions I should ask of Jews, but also then another crucial element, which was comparative, that in other words, to try and work out how, if at all, Jews were different when it came to a variety of factors. Were their patterns of enlistment different from those of other soldiers? Were their rates of promotion different from other soldiers? And again, here, I could draw direct comparison in a variety of ways, but also I could ask questions of Jews specifically. So how did the nature of the demands of Judaism itself, for example, impact their experiences? So, for example, the fact that a Jewish Sabbath is on a Saturday, and the army, again, nominally makes allowances for Sabbath on a Sunday, what likely impact would that have? Likewise, what impact would the nature of the military diet on rations have on Jews, and things of this kind. So the existing and broader literature allowed for both enriching my own thinking about the nature of what the experience of being a soldier would be like, but also then trying to tease out in what ways was the Jewish service distinct.
You make it sound all very easy, Adam, but I have to say it's an extraordinary accomplishment. It sits so prettily on the page. It looks so evident, but it's the result on your part of indefatigable research and just a wonderful, artful synthesis of material. So hats off. One of the things that really struck me was that as your narrative purposely moved away from statistics or data to real people named Glass and Horowitz and Solomon, and as you yourself move away from apologetics to the writing of public-facing history with a fair number of twists and turns that are not always savory, what's at stake?
It's a very good question. So in part, this project is, in large part, it's to recover the everyday experiences of individuals who, for the most part, whose lives went unrecorded, were unremarked upon, and also to restore them in a strange way also to American Jewish history too. That the writing on, as I've already described, the writing on the Civil War is amongst historians of American Jewish history is relatively limited. And to really understand the lives of a population who, for the most part, were recent immigrants, and trying to understand why they enlisted and what the sort of everyday challenges they were. So to restore them as much as possible to the page, to understand their challenges and their lives and their decision making. At the same time, so that's certainly one purpose of the project, was to not to celebrate, but certainly to restore this experience and to try and, as I've suggested earlier, to argue that the Civil War was actually central to American Jewish history. It has a variety of legacies that will play out over time and have great consequences for American Jewish life as well. In part, it's also it is a project which draws, as we described earlier, on the Chappell roster. And what the roster allows for is something else which is very new and very exciting for historians, which is to look at, and again, something you've gestured towards, to be able to look at not just these individual cases, but to look at patterns within the data, to look at, to understand where these people came from, and how their origins, for example, shaped their decisions and their lives as well. So teasing out differences, which is only possible because we have a mass of data collected by the Chappell roster team. And this data is very unusual within the field of Civil War studies more broadly. That certainly there are a number of scholars more recently who've compiled significant data sets, who've looked at large amounts of data. But even by those standards, the Chappell roster itself is on an enormous scale. We're looking at thousands upon thousands of Jewish soldiers, and it allows for certainly again describing and exposing what is distinct about them, but also, again, this is the picture more broadly of soldiers within an army where a very substantial number, more than a quarter of the soldiers within the Union Army are immigrants, and this is a picture of immigrants within the armies. So again, it contributes more broadly to understanding what the nature of the Union Army really was.
So there's this lovely tension then that plays out, a creative tension between the individual and the collective that the roster enables you to do. You mentioned earlier, on several occasions actually, the word legacy. And in that connection, what really struck me hard was the ways in which American Jews of the late 19th century constructed what seemed to me to be their very own version of the lost cause narrative, in which they highlighted heroism and enthusiasm when on the ground both were in short supply. To put it more directly, who knew, you know? So this struck me as a stunning revelation and one of the highlights of your book. And so I'm wondering, as you uncovered the construction of this Jewish version of the lost cause, not so lost after all, bit by bit, as it came to light, were you surprised, taken aback? Did you realize that was your magic moment in this particular text as you unfolded bit by bit the story of their daily lives?
It really was a significant, it's a surprise. So I was aware of Simon Wolf's book, which
Right,
again, Adrian mentioned earlier, which comes out in the 1890s. And likewise, I'm very much aware of the writing about heroic Jewish soldiers, which appears, the apologetic and celebratory literature, which appears later. But I hadn't realized, in which the book again reveals, is that there's a period after the war where, for the most part, the war disappears from American Jewish life. And this is very different from that of other ethnic minorities in the United States that we see instead amongst Germans and Irish and African Americans and others. We see a use of the war, celebration of the war, and celebration of service in the war as a mechanism to push for inclusion in American society, push for citizenship, and again as a but we don't see that amongst Jews. Instead, this very surprising, almost silence, where I read the Jewish press for the decades immediately after the war, expecting, for example, Jewish veterans to be celebrated and to be written about. Instead, they very rarely appear. Again, a surprise. I'd expected that Decoration Day, for example, would be the cause of much celebrating within the Jewish community. Instead, again, aside from occasional references, very little attention to it. This is very much in the North, a somewhat different story in the South. And again, then the question to me was, why was this the case? Why, while other communities are using the war, instrumentalizing the war in a variety of ways, and are celebrating their veterans, why does the Jewish community not do this? And what I came to believe, and I came to argue, is that in a way Jews are chastened by the war, that they experience particularly with anti-Semitism is shocking to them, that they have served during the war. They expect to have their military service celebrated within the broader society, and instead there is this upswelling of anti-Semitism during the war. And after the war, the language I saw again and again in the Jewish press was a desire to move on, that not to focus on the past, but to focus on the future, that create a new post-war America, and in a way not to look back at a war which was actually very difficult for the American Jewish community. And that continues into the 1880s. So certainly in the 1870s and 1880s, we see that. Again, there's clear evidence within American society of an increase of social anti-Semitism, particularly in the late 1870s, and I think this contributes to it. Only then really in the 1880s, and particularly during the 1890s, do we see Jews returning to the war and reimagining the war. And it comes about, in fact, in a very clear way, because of an article in a very prominent magazine by a very prominent journalist and academic who Goldwin Smith accuses Jews effectively of not having served in the war. And this is, of course, a war which is in living memory in the 1890s. This is a war which is a proving ground of loyalty and patriotism to American society. And this public accusation, which is then picked up by a variety of others, becomes an accusation which cannot be ignored. And out of that, we see Simon Wolf.
Wait, slow down. Why can't it be ignored?
I think, again, because the war still, perhaps not still, but in fact, even more so, occupies this position in American society, where by this point in time, there's been a move within America towards a broader reconciliation between North and South, that service and heroism during the war is a marker now of citizenship and patriotism. And this is a moment when large numbers of Eastern European Jews are immigrating to the United States. And again, part of the accusation coming from Goldwin Smith and others that these newcomers can never be good citizens because, look, Jews failed the test during the Civil War. They did not enlist during the Civil War in sufficient numbers. And so therefore we cannot trust these newcomers to become good citizens either. And again, it's such an important charge at such a critical moment where throngs of newcomers arriving. that the Jewish community cannot ignore this. And we see this conscious effort on the part of Simon Wolf and others, and no surprise in a way that it's him, this prominent Jewish figure within Washington, very well connected in a variety of ways, representing B'nai B'rith in Washington, D.C. There's no way that they can ignore it. And he starts this project really of, in a way, restoring Jewish pride in the war and assembling this list of Jews who have served. And at the same, again, roughly the same period of time, we see the emergence of a Hebrew Union Veterans Association. Again, Jews consciously celebrating their participation and contributions during the Civil War. And again, Jews have been active in veterans organizations prior to that point in time. They've been, again, members of the broader secular veterans organizations. But now there's a need to celebrate, in particular, a Jewish service as a response to anti-Semitism. So it's a real fascinating shift with a subject which has been submerged suddenly becomes central during this point in time, and then it takes off.
Right. So that's a terrific revelation, and I'm wondering if it had anything to do at all, maybe, with Reconstruction. You know, clearly it's bound up with immigration, but where might Reconstruction figure in this recalibration?
It's again a very good question that we see again. My early research on Jews within the South after the war, we see there very clearly the impact of Reconstruction, that Jews in the Confederacy, and this is again the Chappell roster team is working on this moment, that Jews for a variety of reasons serve in significant numbers in the Confederacy. It's partly because conscription makes it very difficult not to serve within the Confederate military. That's part of the story. Likewise, there are plenty of Southern Jews who have lived in the South for generations by the time of the Civil War, and are certainly proud of their service, proud of being Southerners too. But we see after the war, at the same moment in time, that Jews in the North become weary of the war, don't want to particularly extol Jewish veterans. We see the opposite happening in the South, and I think it relates to Southern politics and a desire to be included in the dominant mode, or the emergent dominant mode of Southern politics, which is to reinforce their whiteness in the South after the war. So we see very conspicuous displays by Jews in Richmond and elsewhere of Confederate patriotism. So really a Jewish version, explicit Jewish version of the lost cause, which emerges, and we see a much earlier celebration in a whole variety of ways by Jewish veterans. They begin to write memoirs of the war. And to in ways in which Jewish veterans in the North really do not, or in much smaller numbers do so in the North. And so a very different picture there, and I think very much connected with the challenges and desires of Jews in Southern society. Again, I'm generalizing that there are certainly exceptions to this picture, but Jews are trying to position themselves in many cases, understand, unfortunately, where power lies within Southern society. And the Civil War is a way, again, of proving your Southernness, proving your connections with being a white Southerner.
So in both instances, what's key is positioning, although that positioning takes very different forms. Yeah. We've spoken a lot about the broad themes, and I want to turn a little bit to people and wonder if in the course of your research, I know that you've encountered lots of memorable characters, dutiful sons and not so dutiful husbands, and photographers and newspaper editors and politically inclined and overheated rabbis and sutlers, and my favorite, the self-proclaimed Jewish ladies of Syracuse, who I imagine use their fingers to the bone to produce a flag. Any favorites among them?
I certainly
spoke to you. Yeah,
absolutely. I certainly have a list of favorites, and again, one of the pleasures, as you well know, of historical research is getting to know individuals who otherwise are lost to history, or are only known to a few. And I have a collection. I have a rogues gallery of those whose behavior was less than glorious, but certainly were larger than life. But also a number of tragic characters who's again have left some cases substantial traces, sometimes very slender traces in the historical record. So there are again a collection of letters which I can recommend to everyone, the letters of Marcus Spiegel, which have been really beautifully published and are widely available, but are really worth reading. Marcus Spiegel, again, an immigrant, someone living, married, and was living in Ohio, in a relatively small town in Ohio prior to the war. And we see this transition over over the war from being a relatively reluctant recruit, someone who openly writes these wonderful letters to his wife, and his wife saves them. The letters begin with clear evidence that he enlists because of the stay laws, which would, in essence, save his business from bankruptcy. Unfortunately, he had expanded his business just prior to the war, very bad timing, and the war has devastating economic consequences for his business. And so he enlists primarily, he's looking for a bomb-proof job. He's looking for a position which is not too dangerous. And he has his wife, who's a Quaker by origin, is again very reluctant for him to go off to serve. And likewise, the income which military service promises is also very attractive to him, as it is to many soldiers at the time. We see this transition over time, both of his political views, which begin very hostile to the Lincoln administration. He says very angry and gracious things about the Lincoln administration. We see a transition of his political views. We also see his transition of his thinking about the military as well, where this relatively reluctant soldier looking for a bomb-proof job discovers that he actually has a certain a skill as a commander, as an officer, and likewise forms very close bonds with his fellow soldiers. So we see in these letters, which over years, him writing to his wife, and the motivations are changing, and his wife clearly imploring him to come home, and he ultimately resists exactly this. Very rich in this and other ways. Really get a sense of him and his relationship with his wife and his experience as a soldier, and also writing very evocatively about what it's like to be a Jew, and likewise what it's like to be a soldier. So a wonderful, extraordinary letter collection. So Marcus Spiegel is certainly one of those that I became very attached to.
And do you want to share your thoughts about those at whom you might have bristled instead?
So again, there are wonderful characters who are less glorious in their service. My perhaps favorite amongst the rogues were the Eustasi family, brothers, a set of brothers who enlist during the war. They are originally Hungarian. The key brother here is a man by the name of Frederick Eustasi. They've taken he has an aristocratic title. And he's a man who raises a regiment in New York early on in the war, a polyglot regiment drawing from a variety of ethnic communities in New York. In fact, each company in the regiment is supposed to represent a different immigrant group who living in New York City. And he is again has an eye for pageantry. So the uniforms of the regiment are really gaudy, over the top, very stylish. There's a wonderful photograph of the book, in fact, of him and his brother wearing these elaborately designed uniforms. Likewise, the mannerisms that he adopts and the behavior that he adopts, again, is this larger-than-life persona. And again, claiming to be an aristocratic family, claiming that they'd fled Hungary, they'd come to the United States, and then this, and he had an extensive military background, etc. Had gone to a military academy and otherwise. So we know again this regiment and Frederick Eustasi have been written about by other scholars, and because again it's a larger-than-life regiment and individuals, and also because of the somewhat strange and increasingly eccentric behavior of Frederick Eustasi over time. He ultimately lands up in Sing Sing prison during the war. But what was less known about Frederick Eustasi, who presents himself as a Hungarian aristocrat and surrounds himself by others with similar airs, is that that he is not actually Frederick Eustacey, the former secretary to the governor of Halifax, the master swordsman, the dancing master, and otherwise the professor of multiple languages, and otherwise this elaborate persona he's created. He's actually a man by the name of David Strasser, a probably very modest Hungarian immigrant ultimately to the United States, who has invented this elaborate persona for himself. Now, in fact, during the early stage of the war, this accusation is made. It is whispered that maybe Frederick Eustacey is not who he claims to be. Maybe he is a Jew from Hungary, which is of course denied. All sorts of other accusations about him are made too, which do stick. But it's such an outrageous charge that this man might be Jewish. That is beyond belief. But it turns out, yes, he is actually a man of probably a relatively humble background who's invented this wonderful character for himself. And ultimately, it does not turn out so well. He turns out to be not a particularly good commanding officer of a regiment. He falls out with everyone around him. And as I said, he lands up in prison.
On what grounds does he land up in prison?
Fraud. I mean, he's involved. And again, it's not uncommon. What's that?
Economic fraud or something?
Absolutely. So he does what a number of others do, particularly during the early stages of the war, which is that he's responsible for raising the regiment, and pay would, again, determining the amount of pay that you will distribute reflects a number of soldiers that you've recruited. So there is fraud relating to that, and suggestions of fraud relating to supplies and otherwise. And this is, as I said, it's not an uncommon accusation and not an uncommon source of fraud during the early stage of the war. And likewise, there are accusations of nepotism and all sorts of other things connected with him as well. He really is a rascal.
Okay. Do we have time for one more?
Sure.
Okay.
That's another character, another one of my
I meant
favorites.
another question, but you could do.
Oh, another question. Sure. No, please go ahead. I don't want to.
So I want to be sure that I get this one in. We could always come back to your favorite characters. Do you have the book handy?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Right here.
So among the very many haunting passages that you've uncovered and now share with us, perhaps one of the most searing, at least for me, appeared in the Jewish Messenger in February 1862, in which a Jewish soldier writes anonymously of his decision, and presumably that of many of his co-religionists, to keep their Jewishness under wraps. So I'm wondering if you'd be kind enough to read that chunk, that passage on page 103, and then we'll chat a little bit about what he has to say.
So as you said, from a New York-based Jewish newspaper called the Jewish Messenger, and he writes that as a general rule, the Jews do not care to make their religion a matter of notoriety, as it would at once involve them in an intricate, controversial disquisition with the Christian chaplains, for which they do not always feel themselves qualified, and which, of course, can, under no circumstances, afford them anything but annoyance. Some of our brethren fear that, were they known as Hebrews, it would expose them to the taunts and sneers of those among their comrades who have been in the habit of associating with the name of Jew everything that is mean and contemptible.
What do you make of that observation? And how does it figure in your analysis?
Absolutely. So what's interesting about it, a number of things are interesting about it. One is that it appears in a Jewish newspaper. And in a curious way, Jewish soldiers are relatively reticent when it comes to writing to the Jewish press. That yes, we do see accounts in the press which describing the Jewish service, and letters which are sent home, which are republished, but it's relatively rare, and particularly so when it comes to describing difficulties of this kind, when it comes to describing anti-Semitism or the fear of anti-Semitism. Of fear of taunts and sneers, as this describes, or the fears of being targeted by Christian missionaries, for example, or by those who want to convert them. I think what it speaks to is a number of factors. One is that the reality for most Jewish soldiers is an experience of relative isolation, which this really speaks to, that unlike other immigrant and ethnic groups, we really do not see Jewish regiments or even Jewish companies in the military. The typical experience for Jewish soldiers is serving alone or amongst very few other Jewish soldiers. So there really is this loneliness in some cases, the challenges which come with being relatively isolated in terms of practicing as a Jew, and this uncertainty likewise about how your fellow soldiers will respond when and if your Jewishness is revealed. We see, therefore, a variety of strategies adopted by Jews when it comes to what to do with the fact that they are Jewish and at the same time relatively far from other Jewish soldiers. And sometimes it involves serving anonymously, adopting an alias or not revealing your identity as a Jew. Sometimes it clearly involves very carefully revealing it to others. But it's very rarely do I see evidence that the Jews wear their identities proudly and outwardly. Certainly there are cases of this kind, but I think it's, again, reflects both a broader phenomenon within America at the time, which is that there's far more open prejudice against a variety of different groups and a lack of discomfort in terms of expressing negative things about other ethnic or immigrant or racial groups. So certainly it reflects that, and also it reflects that these are, as I've described earlier, these are for the most part are immigrants who are far from home, they're far from family, and often far from support networks, and real uncertainty about what will happen, what the consequences will be if you who are openly identified as Jewish. And that passage certainly reveals this. On the other hand, what becomes clear from looking at other evidence is that, yes, there are moments of anti-Semitism, both on a broader scale, General Grant's General Orders Number 11, a few other episodes of that kind, but on the day-to-day basis, that I think for many soldiers, such fears or such concerns are misplaced, that the experience of serving shoulder to shoulder in this intense camaraderie which develops within units as people are eating together, they're living in close proximity with one another, that yes, there are cases of very nasty anti-Semitism, of hostility to Jews as Jews, but that seems to, for the most part, seems to be the exception rather than the norm. Instead, that this, in a way, familiarity breeds not contempt, but the opposite. It breeds a sense of fellowship with those that you serve with. And you see it again in the pension records, veterans records, etc. That these bonds continue after the war as well.
Okay, so pulling all these disparate, complicated threads together, would you say at the end of the day, as your kind of ta-da moment, that the relationship of the Jews to civil war both mirrors and stands apart from the larger frame of American Jewish life, or in more direct language, where does it fit?
Into American Jewish life?
Yeah.
Certainly there are certainly continuities in a whole variety of ways and both in terms of the experience of soldiers and likewise what it prefigures for example, later for Jewish service in other wars, in the First World War and the Second World War as well. In terms of continuities, interesting continuities from the pre-war period as well, that yes, most Jews living in the United States are relative newcomers in 1861. They've arrived in many cases in the 1840s and even more so in the 1850s, and many of them have come as single men and have lived these lives, in many cases start out as peddlers in the countryside, as hawking goods, as experience of isolation, experience of trying to develop a new world for yourself in the United States, having to work out what it means to yourself to be Jewish in America, in a place where now you can shape your identity in many ways which you could not in the old world. And so I think there are continuities there, that the war and military service provides these young Jewish men with opportunities again to remold themselves, to choose what name they will serve under, to choose how they're going to present themselves to their fellow soldiers, to choose how important their Jewishness will be with the military, important or not important as well. So there are certainly a variety of continuities there. And likewise, what we see too is that the Civil War is distinctive in a variety of ways from Jewish military service in the First World War and the Second World War as well. There's the nature of the Civil War armies and the nature of American society at this moment in time, but we do see the beginning of patterns which will occur later as well. For example, what comes out of the war, and something which I pointed to earlier, is this sense amongst Jewish veterans that they have a distinct experience, and that the experience means something. And we see this particularly with the formation of the Hebrew Union Veterans Association in the 1890s, that this particular pride in military service and the Americanness which emerges. Then we certainly see that on a very substantial scale, particularly after the Second World War as well, that the sense of GIs, again, and here perhaps Jewish experience is not dissimilar from that of many other groups who serve in the Second World War too, that the sense that your service has meant something, and that America, not that it owes something to you, but it's reinforced your citizenship, your rights to full inclusion in American society. And we certainly begin to see that coming out of the Civil War, particularly later amongst Jewish veterans as well.
And perhaps the corollary notion that America is the better for it. But we'll leave that for another time. I believe there are some splendid questions that are awaiting you.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for that lovely conversation. So a number of questions have been posted in the chat, and the first question relates to the first Jewish army chaplain, and related to that was the highest rank a Jew achieved in the Union Army. The second part of that question is easy to answer, that we do see Jewish colonels serving within the military during the war, and a number of officers are then breveted, are promoted, given these honorary promotions, which aren't necessarily confirmed, to much higher ranks, to brigadier general and above. But really during the war, we see a number of Jewish colonels, certainly plenty of Jewish lieutenant colonels and captains and lieutenants and otherwise. In fact, the book contains, as one of the appendices, a listing of Jews who achieve higher ranks and officer rank during the war. And likewise, we didn't talk about Jews who received the Medal of Honor, but likewise, there's a listing of those who do. So there's plenty of cases of celebrated Jewish service during the war, and individuals who really do extraordinary things during the war as well. The story relating to military chaplains is an interesting one. That one of the regulations and laws which are created during the war is that every regiment is entitled to appoint a military chaplain. The officers can vote on the appointment of a chaplain. And because, as I described earlier, we don't see the emergence of Jewish regiments or even Jewish companies, it means that Jews are dispersed through the Union Army, even though there are some units where we see high proportion of Jews. There are very few regiments where Jews make up a substantial enough percentage of the regiment that it can be a strong argument for appointing a Jewish officer, a Jewish chaplain. There is an exception to this: the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry, which has a Jewish colonel earlier in the war, and the officer corps, again, we see in this regiment a number of Jews. They do appoint or try to appoint a Jewish chaplain, and this becomes a cause of contention. Again, I write about this in the book, and it's an episode which is relatively well known, although my take on it and the evidence I found is somewhat different than has been presented in the past. It's a regiment where the Jewish chaplain is forced to resign because the ordinance and then the law, Congressional Act, which creates the office of chaplain, specifies that a chaplain has to be a member of a Christian denomination. This becomes an issue then which ultimately requires the intervention of lobbying by the Jewish community and the intervention of Lincoln. Ultimately, the law is changed. We see again one later Jewish chaplain who is appointed. He's appointed not so much because he's Jewish, but because he's available and because he joins a regiment where there are a number of Central Europeans, a number of German speakers, and he shares that background. Again, he has a somewhat unsatisfactory experience within that regiment, as is common with chaplains. Chaplains are not necessarily popular figures within many units. We see more in the way of Jewish hospital chaplains during the war. So in places where we see Union military hospitals, we see Jews appointed, either by the Union Army, or again, spending much time visiting Jewish and other soldiers within these hospitals. So again, an interesting story, one which is covered in depth within the book as well. A very good question. Another question about what was the appeal for Jews for immigrating, for Jews who'd immigrated to enlist. And it's something a question I thought about a lot. That, as I described earlier, these are newcomers to the United States for the most part. They're people who've been in America in some cases for 10 or fewer years, sometimes with just a handful of years before they enlist. And a variety of motivations, sometimes very heroic. Professor Joseph was asking earlier about one of my favorite characters. Another favorite character is someone called August Bondy, who leaves behind a wonderful memoir at the end of his life, describing a really unusual life as someone who'd been a 48er, who'd fought in who joined the liberal revolutions in Europe, and then effectively flees to America as a very young man, becomes involved in Bleeding Kansas. He rides with John Brown, an extraordinary figure, and he's an ideological enlistee. He signs up because of the cause of both defending the Union and because of his strong abolitionist views as well. But we see everything from, that's perhaps at the one end of the spectrum, everything from that to perhaps most common of all, desire to defend the Union. That these are immigrants who've come to America because they many for economic reasons, but also because this admiration for what American society is. They admire the Republic, and a sense that the Republic might be undone is something which is deeply troubling to them. So certainly they enlist to defend the Union. Likewise, plenty who enlist to defend the Union, but do so for the same reasons that other recent immigrants enlist, because the economy is devastated by secession, and they need work, they need an income, and they expect that this will be a quick and glorious war, and they enlist for the glory and the promise of a steady wage. And that's very common, certainly amongst Jews and the broader American population, the Union population in 1861, 1862. So a variety of reasons why immigrants would enlist. But perhaps what sets Jews apart in some cases from others is that we see, as I described earlier, very early on in the war, already in the first summer of the war, the rise of anti-Semitism and this accusation that Jews prefer profits to patriotism, that they're making money off the war as crooked contractors, all of these accusations which are hurled at the community, deeply troubling to the community. And this undoubtedly has an effect on enlistment as well, that we see Irish and Germans, for example, they also will experience a prejudice during the war itself, but typically later, that they sour on the war somewhat after Jews, really in late in 1862 into 1863. So Jews experience this negative effect much earlier on than do others. So again, an interesting way that Jewish experience from others. A final question, perhaps I see that we're really running out of time, which is what happened? Do you have any stories? What actually happened when Jewish soldiers found out that others were Jewish? And I'll end with what to me is a tragic story connected with August Bondy, who I referred to a moment ago, the immigrant from Austria who had been a 48er and then an ideological and really committed to abolitionism and etc. He finds out, he joins a Kansas cavalry regiment, and he finds out that two of his fellow soldiers are Jewish, but one in a very tragic way, that he approaches a soldier during the war and asks him, "Are you Jewish?" And the soldier denies it. He says, "No, I'm Hungarian. I'm not Jewish." And how does he later establish that the soldier actually is Jewish? The soldier dies during the war, and another soldier approaches August Bondy and says to him, "Here are his papers. Here are the dead soldier's papers, and they contain a language which we do not understand. It contain letters written to and from the soldier's parents, written in Yiddish, which Bondy understands, and which clearly identify him as Jewish." It's again a fascinating case where a soldier is for a variety of reasons, perhaps reluctant to even share with another soldier that he's Jewish, but even as he clearly is, the letters home and the letters from his parents are talking about Jewish festivals, what the dates of Jewish festivals are. So really a tragic story of this kind. Let us end there. So a great thank you to Professor Joslet, likewise to Adrian Dalmas, and likewise also to our audience this afternoon and this evening. And a final substantial thank you to the National Archives, both for this program and for the wonderful resources which have made both the Chappell roster possible and also many of the stories and much of the research of my book possible as well. So thank you so much, everyone.